The manager slid the resignation letter across the desk and said one sentence that changed everything. Either you stop praying on company time, or you don't have a job here on Monday. My name is Mubarak, and I want to tell you exactly what happened next, because what came after that moment is something I still think about every single day. And by the end of this, you'll understand why so many Muslims across this country are quietly living through the exact same test, right now, in offices and warehouses and hospitals you'd never expect. I need to take you back a little first, because you won't understand why that sentence hit me the way it did unless you know where I came from. I grew up in a house where my father worked 2 jobs and still never missed a prayer, not once. Not even when his boss threatened to cut his hours for taking 10 minutes at sunset. I used to watch him come home exhausted, hands cracked from cold warehouse floors, and still roll out that same faded prayer mat like it was the only thing keeping him standing. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was just tradition, something older people did out of habit. It wasn't until years later, standing in a hallway outside a locked office with my own career hanging by a thread, that I finally understood what he'd been protecting all along. There's a specific memory from when I was maybe 14 that I keep coming back to. My father worked at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place with concrete floors that stayed cold well into spring, and he had a shift supervisor who used to time bathroom breaks with an actual stopwatch, not as a joke, but as company policy written into an employee handbook nobody had ever bothered to update. My father found a rhythm early on, praying Dar during his lunch break in a corner behind some pallets, folding a jacket down as a makeshift mat, because bringing an actual prayer rug in felt like inviting a conversation he didn't want to have every single day. One winter, a new supervisor took over that shift, younger, more aggressive about numbers, and he caught my father in that corner and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. My father told him plainly. The supervisor didn't say much in the moment, just walked away. But 2 days later my father was pulled into a short meeting and told that unscheduled breaks outside the designated 15-minute windows would now result in a formal write-up. No exceptions. I remember my father coming home that night quieter than usual. My mother asked him what was wrong, and he just said work was work. It wasn't until years later, when I was old enough to actually understand what had happened, that he told me the rest of it. He said he kept praying in that same corner anyway, right up or not, for almost 3 more months, because moving it later in the day wasn't something he was willing to negotiate on, not because he thought it would fix anything, but because some things, in his words, weren't his to bargain away just because someone else decided they were inconvenient. He eventually got 2 formal write-ups over it. He never got fired. I asked him once if he was scared during those months, and he said of course he was, every single day. But being scared and being wrong were 2 completely different things, and he refused to confuse one for the other. That distinction stuck with me longer than almost anything else he ever taught me, and it was sitting in the back of my mind the entire time everything with Denise was unfolding. Whether I consciously realized it or not, I took the job at a mid-sized logistics and client services company right out of college, the kind of place that looks great on a resume, fast-paced, ambitious, always chasing the next contract. The first few months were fine. Nobody said anything about my prayer breaks because honestly, nobody noticed. I'd slip into an empty conference room, pray quickly, and be back at my desk before anyone asked where I went. I told myself this was sustainable. I told myself I'd found a way to balance both worlds without anyone having to know there was ever a conflict at all. Then we landed a client that changed the entire rhythm of the office. A logistics firm on the West Coast, 3 hours behind us, which meant our afternoon meetings kept sliding later and later into what used to be my Acer and eventually my Maghrib window. At first it was manageable. I'd excuse myself for 5 minutes between calls. But the account grew. And so did the pressure, and soon my manager, a sharp, high-energy woman named Denise who had built her whole career on being available around the clock, started noticing the pattern. She never said anything directly at first. She just started scheduling calls slightly earlier, slightly later, testing where my limits were, the way people do when they're trying to figure out if you'll bend. I remember the first time she said something out loud. We were in a client call that ran long, and I told her quietly that I needed 5 minutes before the next one. She looked at me like I'd said something absurd. 5 minutes for what? She asked, in front of 2 other coworkers. I told her the truth. I said I needed to pray. There was a pause in that room that felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably 3 seconds. Then she said, "We'll talk about this later," and moved on like nothing happened. But I knew something had shifted. I knew I was no longer invisible in that particular way anymore. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the look on her face, trying to decide if I was overreacting or if I'd just opened a door I couldn't close. I called my father, half expecting him to tell me to just be more careful, to keep it quieter, to find a way around it. Instead, he asked me one question that stuck with me for the rest of this whole ordeal. He asked, "Did you feel ashamed when you said it? Or did you feel like you were asking permission for something that was never theirs to give?" I didn't have an answer for him that night. I do now. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface, but tense underneath. Denise started seeking her boss on emails involving my performance. Small things, nitpicking response times, questioning why I stepped away during certain windows. I began to feel like I was being documented, like a case file was slowly being built somewhere I couldn't see. I want to be honest with you. There were nights I considered just stopping. Not stopping praying entirely, but pushing it later, combining prayers in ways that weren't really necessary, just to remove the friction. I told myself it was temporary, just until this project ended, just until things calmed down. Around that time I remembered something a coworker had mentioned months earlier, almost in passing, about a nurse she used to work with named Amina. Amina worked 12-hour shifts in a hospital that didn't have a dedicated prayer room, and for over a year she prayed in a supply closet between patients, sometimes on a folded jacket instead of a mat, because she didn't want to be seen carrying one around. One day a new charge nurse found her in there and reported it as unauthorized use of a restricted space. And Amina was pulled into a meeting where she genuinely believed she was about to be let go. But instead of apologizing or minimizing what she was doing, she calmly explained why those minutes mattered to her, why they weren't optional, why they were the reason she could handle the weight of everything else in that building. The charge nurse, to everyone's surprise, ended up personally advocating for a small prayer space to be added near the break room, not because of policy, but because watching someone hold onto something that firmly made her reconsider her own priorities. I didn't know Amina personally. I'd only heard the story secondhand, but it planted something in me. It made me wonder if the moment I was dreading might not be the ending I assumed it would be. Still, my situation kept escalating. Denise scheduled a call for 4:30 on a Thursday, right in the middle of my Acer window during the shorter days of the year, and made it clear in the invite that attendance was mandatory for all key stakeholders. I remember staring at that email for almost 10 minutes. I wasn't looking for a loophole anymore. I think somewhere in that silence I made a decision, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, that I would not let this keep shrinking. I prayed. I was maybe 6 minutes late to the call. Denise didn't say anything in the meeting itself. She was too professional for that in front of the client, but afterward she asked me to stay back. That's when she said it. That's the moment from the very beginning of this story. Either you stop praying on company time, or you don't have a job here on Monday. I want you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make these things look. There was no shouting. She said it almost tiredly, like she was more annoyed than angry, like she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. And for one full second, I actually considered agreeing. I thought about my rent, my student loans, the fact that jobs in this market weren't easy to come by, the fact that nobody around me would blame me if I just quietly adjusted. But then I thought about my father's cracked hands on that prayer mat, and Amina in that supply closet, and I heard myself say something I hadn't planned to say. I said, "I'm not going to do that. But I am willing to talk about how we can make the scheduling work better for everyone." She didn't respond. She just told me HR would be in touch. The next few days were some of the most anxious of my life. I kept my phone close, checking email obsessively, half expecting a termination notice to appear at any moment. I told my roommate what had happened, and he asked me flatly if I regretted it. I didn't, but I wasn't sure yet if not regretting it would be enough to survive what came next. The HR meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I remember walking into that building that morning feeling like I was walking into a courtroom rather than an office. Sitting across from me were Denise, someone from HR named Robert, and to my surprise, Denise's own manager, a regional director I'd only met once before, a quiet man named Carl, who rarely got involved in day-to-day matters like this. I assumed his presence meant this was worse than I thought. I assumed I was about to be walked out with a box for my desk items already waiting somewhere. Instead, Carl started by asking me to explain, in my own words, exactly what accommodation I was asking for. Not what Denise had reported, but what I actually needed. I explained it plainly. I wasn't asking to skip work. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for a 5 to 10 minute window during specific times of day, the same way people take smoke breaks or step out for personal calls without anyone documenting it as a performance issue. Robert from HR pulled out a folder, and I braced myself for the worst. But what he said next surprised me. He said that under federal workplace protections, religious accommodation requests like mine were not just permitted, they were something the company was legally required to reasonably accommodate, provided it didn't cause undue hardship on operations. He said Denise's approach, treating this as a disciplinary matter rather than an accommodation request, had actually exposed the company to more risk than my 5 minutes ever could. I watched Denise's face change in real time. She wasn't expecting that either. I think, looking back, she genuinely believed she was managing an efficiency problem, not realizing she'd stumbled into something with actual legal weight behind it. Carl asked her directly why this hadn't been handled as a simple accommodation conversation months earlier, instead of escalating into threats. She didn't have a clean answer. The meeting that I thought would end my job instead ended with Carl instructing HR to formally document my accommodation and adjust the recurring client call time by 15 minutes, permanently, going forward. I want to sit in that HR meeting a little longer with you, because there's a detail I skipped that actually matters. Right before Carl gave his final instruction to formally document my accommodation, there was a long silence in that room. Maybe 15 or 20 seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you're the one sitting in it, waiting to hear if your income is about to disappear. Robert was flipping through his folder again. Denise was staring at a spot on the table like it owed her an explanation. And Carl, this quiet man I barely knew, was just looking at me, not with hostility. More like he was actually trying to understand something he'd never had to think carefully about before. He finally asked me one more question before wrapping things up. He asked how long 5 to 10 minutes actually took in practice, whether it was always exactly that or sometimes longer. I told him honestly, sometimes it ran a minute or two over depending on the day, but I always made it up by staying slightly later or skipping part of my own lunch break to keep pace with deadlines. I hadn't planned to say that part. It just came out. Robert looked up from his folder at that point, and I found out afterward that detail specifically, that I'd been quietly compensating the time on my own without anyone asking me to, was the thing that shifted the tone in that room from a compliance conversation into something closer to respect. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, clean and simple. But life rarely wraps up that neatly. And the real turning point hadn't even happened yet. Because 2 weeks after that meeting, something happened that none of us saw coming. The West Coast client, the one whose scheduling had caused all of this tension in the first place, had their own internal crisis. Their lead account contact was let go abruptly amid a company restructuring, and for almost a full week nobody on their end responded to any of our calls or emails. Panic spread through our office. Denise, the same woman who had once threatened my job over a prayer break, was now the one under real pressure, because if this account collapsed, it would land squarely on her department. During that chaotic week, it was Carl who remembered something small I'd mentioned in passing during our earlier meeting. Something almost irrelevant at the time. I had once mentioned that during my brief conversations with one of the client's junior coordinators, a woman named Patricia, we'd bonded slightly over a shared interest in her volunteer work at a local community center. It was such a small detail I'd forgotten I'd even said it. But Carl asked if I still had her direct contact information, separate from the corporate email that had gone silent. I did. I reached out to her personally, not as a business contact chasing an account, but the way you'd reach out to check on someone during a hard time. She responded within an hour. It turned out she hadn't been part of the layoffs at all. She'd simply been buried under the confusion of the transition and assumed someone else was handling communication with us. That one personal connection, built from a 5-minute conversation months earlier, ended up being the thread that kept the entire account from falling apart. Carl brought this up in a leadership meeting afterward, not as a footnote, but as the reason the account survived. And when he explained how that relationship had formed, he specifically mentioned that it grew out of the same conversations Denise had once viewed as a distraction, the ones happening around my prayer breaks, and the small human moments that came with them. It wasn't lost on anyone in that room that the very thing Denise had tried to eliminate had quietly become part of what saved the account. I wasn't in that meeting. I heard about it afterward from Robert, who told me almost laughing that Carl had said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that sometimes the things that look like inconvenience on a calendar are actually the things holding the whole operation together. Denise never apologized to me directly, not in so many words, but something shifted after that. She stopped scrutinizing my schedule. She stopped sickying her boss on unrelated emails. A few months later, when a new hire on our team, a young man named Tariq, quietly asked her during onboarding if there was somewhere private he could pray during his shift, she didn't hesitate. She personally walked him to the same small conference room I used to sneak into and told him it was fine to use it whenever he needed. I only found out about that secondhand too, from Tariq himself, who had no idea about everything that led up to that moment being made available to him without a single question asked. I think about that a lot. I think about how none of it happened because I was clever, or because I found the perfect argument to win someone over. It happened because I refused to shrink something that mattered, even when every practical voice in my head told me it would be easier to just let it go. I think about my father again, about all those years he prayed on cold floors while people around him assumed it was just habit, not realizing he was quietly holding a line that would one day matter more than any of us understood at the time. There's a verse that kept coming back to me during those weeks, the one where Allah says that whoever is mindful of Allah, He will make a way out for them, and will provide for them from where they do not expect. I used to hear that verse recited and nod along the way you do with something familiar, without really absorbing it. But sitting in that HR meeting, and later hearing about Patricia and Carl and the account that almost collapsed, I understood it differently. The way out wasn't obvious. It didn't look like divine intervention in some dramatic, visible way. It looked like ordinary office politics, legal policy, a coincidental personal relationship with a client contact. But underneath all of that ordinary detail was something I can't explain any other way except as a way out from where I genuinely did not expect it. I want to tell you about one more thing before I close this out, because it's the piece that made me want to share this story publicly in the first place. About 6 months after all of this settled, I was having lunch with a friend of mine, a guy named Yusuf who drives for a regional delivery company, and I mentioned what had happened at my job. He got quiet for a second, and then told me something that stopped me completely. He said drivers at his company get penalized for taking unscheduled stops, tracked by GPS, timed down to the minute, and that praying on shift for him usually meant pulling into a gas station parking lot, stepping just outside the vehicle, and praying standing in a corner near the dumpsters, because there was nowhere else private enough. He said a dispatcher once questioned an unusual stop pattern on his route, and he genuinely thought he was going to be written up. Instead, when he explained what the stops were for, the dispatcher, a woman close to retirement who Yusuf said rarely showed emotion about anything, quietly adjusted his route templates going forward to build in small buffer windows near those same stops, without ever officially labeling it as anything. She never called it an accommodation. She just quietly made the space exist. Hearing that from Yusuf made me realize this wasn't some isolated situation unique to my office. It's happening in hospitals and warehouses and delivery routes and corporate towers all over this country, right now, in ways most people never hear about, because the people going through it usually don't talk about it publicly. Every single person in these stories, my father Amina, Yusuf, myself, we were all just ordinary people trying to hold on to something small and non-negotiable in the middle of environments that weren't built with us in mind. None of us had some grand plan. We just refused to let the line move, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. There's another story I need to tell you before I close this out, because it complicates things in a way I think is important, and it involves someone I actually knew personally, not secondhand like Amina or Yusuf. A close friend from college, a software engineer named Hassan, worked at a startup where the culture prided itself on being always on. The kind of place where people bragged about answering Slack messages at midnight like it was a badge of honor. Hassan had been quietly stepping away for a few minutes around sunset for over a year without any issue, until a new product manager joined the team, a guy who ran everything by metrics and dashboards, tracking response times to the second. This new manager noticed a small dip in Hassan's average reply speed during a specific window each evening, flagged it in a performance report, and without ever asking Hassan directly what was going on, forwarded it up the chain as a concern about engagement and availability. Hassan found out about the report almost by accident, when a teammate mentioned it in passing, assuming Hassan already knew. He told me he felt a specific kind of anger in that moment, not just about the accusation itself, but about being reported on without ever being asked directly what those minutes were for. He said it felt like being judged by someone who decided the story before bothering to ask what the story even was. He confronted the product manager directly, calmly but firmly, and explained exactly what those minutes were and why they weren't going anywhere. The product manager, to his credit, seemed genuinely embarrassed and said he simply hadn't thought to ask before escalating it. But the damage to trust between them lingered for months afterward, and Hassan told me honestly that he never fully let his guard down around that guy again. I'm telling you about Hassan specifically because his story didn't end in some clean, satisfying reversal the way mine did with Denise, or the way Amina's did with that supply closet, or Yusuf's did with that dispatcher quietly adjusting his routes. Hassan's ending was smaller and messier, a strained professional relationship that never fully healed, an apology that came but trust that didn't fully return with it. And I think that matters, because it would be dishonest of me to make it sound like holding this line always leads to some clean, redemptive turn where the person who challenged you ends up becoming your biggest advocate. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just means you keep your dignity intact while the relationship around you stays permanently a little more guarded than it used to be. Hassan still works there. He still steps away at the same time every evening. But he told me he stopped expecting anyone on that team to ever really understand why. And he made peace with that a long time ago. What struck me most, thinking about Hassan alongside my own situation with Denise, is how differently the exact same kind of pressure can resolve depending on the person on the other side of the desk. Denise had Carl above her, someone willing to actually look into the legal reality of the situation. Hassan's product manager had nobody above him forcing that same reckoning. So the resolution stalled at an apology instead of a real structural change. Amina got a charge nurse who was moved enough to build something new. Yusuf got a dispatcher near retirement who'd clearly seen enough of life to know which battles were worth fighting quietly on someone else's behalf. None of us controlled which version of an ending we'd get walking in. All any of us controlled was whether we'd still be standing on the same ground by the time it was over, regardless of which way the other person leaned. If there's one thing I want you to walk away with from all of this, it's that the moment right before you think you're about to lose everything is very often the exact moment you're closest to a shift you can't yet see coming. I had no idea, sitting across from Denise that day, hearing those words about Monday, that within a few months the same manager would be personally walking a new hire toward the same private space she once tried to take from me. I had no idea that a 5-minute conversation about a community center would end up saving an entire client account. None of us ever really know, in the moment, which small act of holding firm is quietly setting something bigger into motion. I think about Tariq sometimes too, the new hire who got shown that conference room without ever having to ask twice, without ever having to sit through a meeting like the one I sat through. He has no idea what it took for that door to be open for him the way it was. He just assumes it was always like that this was simply how things worked at that company. And honestly, I think that's exactly how it's supposed to work. Nobody should have to know the full weight of what came before them just to receive something that should have been theirs from the start. My father never got to see a version of his warehouse where prayer breaks were normalized. Amina still doesn't know if that supply closet story changed anything beyond her own hospital. Yusuf's dispatcher never called what she did anything more than an adjusted route template. Most of this labor stays invisible, absorbed quietly by people who will never get a public thank you for it. And I think that's part of what makes it meaningful rather than performative. It was never done to be seen. I'll be honest, there were nights during all of this where I questioned whether I was making the right call, whether I was being stubborn about something I could have quietly compromised on, without anyone getting hurt. If you're listening to this, and you're in some version of that same tension right now, at your job, in your school, in your own family, I'm not going to pretend I know your exact situation, or that it will resolve exactly the way mine did. Some stories like this don't end with the manager coming around. Some end with someone actually losing the job, and having to rebuild from there. And I don't want to pretend that risk isn't real, because it is. But what I will say is that every person I've mentioned tonight, myself included, has said the exact same thing looking back. Not one of us regretted holding the line, even in the versions where the outcome was harder than we hoped for. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer down in the comments. Out of everything in this story, was it my moment with Denise, or Amina in that supply closet? or Yusuf praying near the dumpsters at a gas station that hit you the hardest? I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to know which part of tonight's story stayed with you the longest. And if this reached you the way I hope it did, share it with someone in your life who's quietly carrying the same weight right now. Someone who might need to hear tonight that the line they're holding onto matters more than they realize. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of stories, real, ordinary, unresolved in the moment, and I'll see you in the next one, inshallah.